So, one of the things that comes up a lot when we're talking with clients about document accessibility, of course, the scoping is really important, but also the archival exceptions, right? Under ADA Title II, there are some exceptions to the ruling that state there are certain types of documents that don't have to be made accessible by the deadlines of those rules. And it can be really confusing.
There's a lot of confusion, and I think that people are really looking for security in the idea that if I archive these documents, did I do the right thing? And then am I truly not responsible for the accessibility of that document anymore? So, to your point, built into Title II is a set of rules that essentially says if this document is not the most up-to-date version. Maybe it's out-of-date information. Maybe we've put out a new handbook since this handbook or something like that. If it is not something that users, it's critical information that users need to get from your organization, or if it is information that it's a document that we are not planning to update in the future. And that's a big one. If we are not planning to update this document in the future, it's not the most up to date. There's a new version. For whatever reason, it is not something that's going to be critical and it's out of date. You can archive that document. This was not designed to say, hey, if you think that this helpful handout on summer activities in your town is not critical information, you don't have you can archive it. That is not the intention. The intention was really so that you aren't spending your time and your money, your effort remediating meeting minutes from 2010 that are likely never going to be looked at again. So this is really to give you an avenue to make the law easier to comply with while still maintaining the integrity of the law.
Yeah, I think obviously thinking back to high risk forms, right, or high risk documents, making sure that you understand this document is vital for consumers to be able to access this information or this service, or this
Mhm.
form must be filled out. Those are examples of even if that form hasn't been adjusted in the last 5 to 10 years, that form is still in active use, right? And so that is something that doesn't qualify for an archival exception even though it hasn't been changed in so long, by virtue of the fact that it's necessary to access the service and it is the document that is currently in use. Right. The best way to think about archival documents is really kind of thinking about it as a designated archival section on your website, right? So forms information that is current, that are actively in use by your service or that consumers need to use your service aren't going to be in that archive section, right? Meeting minutes, things like that, old blueprint files that haven't been adjusted, right? Those are examples of documents that are considered archive. But something that's super important to keep in mind is that A, if you update the documents, if you change them at all, they no longer qualify for this exception, right? Documents that were created after the effective date of the rule don't qualify for this archive exception. And so if you update a document following the effective date of the rule, then that document has to be made accessible. And then in terms of providing users access to these archive documents, you need to have a process in place for users to be able to request it, right? Maybe for some reason I need those old meeting minutes from 2012, right? How do I get those meeting minutes in an accessible format? And so even though this document might fall under the archival exception of the Title II rule, it doesn't mean that it doesn't fall under the Americans with Disabilities Act. You're still required to provide equally effective access to this document upon request. So how does a user request it? Right. So having a good accessibility statement, contact information, a form, a designated phone number, customer support training. That way people know what to do if somebody with a disability contacts them and says, I need an accessible version of that archive document.
Right. So, what you're saying is that even if documents aren't required to be made accessible to meet ADA Title II compliance deadlines, that if a resident or a citizen calls the local county department and says, "Hey, I want access to this old court filing, or I want to look at old public land records, and I need an accessible format," that department and agency still has a responsibility to provide them with an accessible format.
Correct. Yep. That is still required under the Americans with Disabilities Act, the requirement to provide equally effective access to communications. And so even though you don't necessarily have to proactively make those documents accessible under the Title II rule, if they are archived, if somebody with a disability says I need access to a file in that archived, under the Americans with Disabilities Act, you are obligated to provide them an accessible version of that file upon request.
As you are going through the process of scoping and understanding your documents, you're starting at the top of that list with your newest documents and you are remediating those. Start at the other end of the list, the oldest documents you have, and that's probably where you want to start archiving. So you can parallel process these and do these together. The other thing that's important to note is for a document to be considered archived, it needs to be in an archived area of your site, and it needs to be clearly marked on that page and on the document that that is meant to be archived. So it does need to be marked in those two places to fall under the requirements of Title II and to technically be archived. So ensure that you are checking those boxes as well.